Have you ever imagined what you would do if you heard, in so many words, the people who were supposed to protect you calling you a burden? You know that feeling when you realize that the ground is disappearing, that the home where you grew up has become a minefield, and that no one there is really on your side. I thought it was impossible for someone to lose everything without raising suspicion, but when my name became synonymous with inconvenience, I had to decide whether I would accept it in silence or do something that would change everything. Selling my $1 million home wasn't just about money. It was about surviving the humiliation, dealing with parents who never gave me peace, and figuring out how far I would go when there was nothing left. But before I show you the moment when everything fell apart, you need to understand what my life was like up until then. June 24th, 2019, 6:35 in the morning. It was Tuesday, but it could have been any other day in that small town in the countryside of Connecticut. My name is Amelia Reed. The sun hadn't even reached the kitchen window when I was already up, setting the table for breakfast. There were days when the only thing that kept me going was that routine, preparing the water, separating the grounds, listening to the sound of the coffee slowly brewing. I've always been the type of person who pays attention to small details. Maybe because I grew up with my grandmother Margaret telling me that the world is made of details. She taught me from an early age that every object in the house had a story, a reason for being there. The porcelain sugar bowl that was only used on Sundays, the wall clock inherited from my great-grandfather, the flowered rug that she herself wove with her own hands, everything held a memory. Margaret was never much of a hugger, but she had a way of looking at me that would make any child lower their head and think twice before doing something stupid. I remember her sitting next to the radio, always wearing a long skirt and her hair tied up with clips. Even after it became difficult to climb stairs, she insisted on taking care of the plants on the terrace and making coffee every morning, just because she liked the smell wafting through the house. When someone asks who taught me how to live, the answer always comes automatically. It was my grandmother, from the time she let me help her sift the flour for the cornmeal cake, or sent me to collect eggs in the chicken coop at the back of the yard. The address of the house was 117 Willow Street, an old 2-story house with a white porch and vines growing halfway up the wall. On cold days, the breeze was really sharp. The gas heater, installed in 1998, never worked properly. Sometimes it only heated the hallway. The fireplace in the living room was older than I was, and whenever the smoke came back up the chimney, Margaret complained about the maintenance, but she never considered replacing it with anything modern. Here, every piece of furniture seemed hand-picked, and nothing came into the house without a good reason. Ever since I was a child, I spent most of my afternoons on that same brown couch, my feet propped up on the wood chest, listening to Margaret tell me stories about hard times, about the jobs she took to buy that land in 1974, about the promises she made to never abandon her family, even when things got bad. She told me how she learned to negotiate prices at the market, to save her change, and to defend what was hers. In the backyard, the jasmine she planted is still alive. My grandfather died when I was 9. I remember the funeral, the light rain, and the sound of footsteps on the gravel. Margaret was widowed early, but she never let anyone feel sorry for her. The house on Willow Street had never been luxurious, but after Margaret passed away, everything in it seemed larger than it actually was. The old cabinets, the worn hardwood floors, and even the cracks in the ceiling bore the story of whoever built this home brick by brick. When the lawyer called to say that the house was in my name and that the market value had surpassed $1 million, I stared at the paper, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. It was real money, the kind you only see in real estate ads, but that wasn't what kept me there. I felt like I still had to protect what Margaret had left behind. It wasn't about the house, it was about her trust in me. Deep down, I knew that house wasn't just concrete and wood. It was a reminder of everything I had survived, of the cold winter mornings with homemade bread, of the quiet conversations after dinner, of the scoldings that came whenever I complained about getting up early to help clean the porch. The smell of breakfast and warm bread was what stuck in my memory the most. There were times when I would come home tired from work, open the door, and just smell the old cabinet, and I knew I was home. October 8, 2018 was Margaret's last birthday. We baked a simple cake, bought flowers, and sat the three of us, me, her, and my Aunt Claire, around the dining table, reminiscing about the time the house was almost repossessed because of a debt at the bank. She told me how she went to bed, not knowing if she would be able to pay what she owed, but in the end, she always found a way. Margaret was tough, proud, stubborn, and capable of staying up all night just to make sure no one touched what was hers. When he left that house to me, it wasn't just for lack of options or because I was the closest granddaughter. It was because she trusted that, even after everything, I would have the courage to hold on to what was mine without bowing my head to anyone. Every corner of that place was a reminder that nothing came easy, that every achievement required sacrifice and persistence. And perhaps that was why, even after signing the lawyer's receipt and seeing the amount written in full, $1 million, I continued to clean the garden, sweep leaves from the porch, and check the mailbox as if nothing had changed. Deep down, I knew that I was carrying a weight on my shoulders much greater than that pile of bricks and tiles. The true value of that house was not in the money, but in what Margaret expected of me. I thought I knew what responsibility was, but that was just the beginning of the nightmare. I had just started sorting through the old cabinets, still trying to get used to Margaret's absence, when my parents showed up on Willow Street for the first time. It wasn't a surprise. I'd already gotten calls from my mother, Susan, talking about overdue bills, the cost of car insurance, the lack of space in their Pine Avenue apartment. My father, Charles, didn't usually ask for anything, just said, "We're going to stay with you for a few days next week, Amelia, just until the dust settles." It was always just for a while, but no one ever said how long. At first, it was strange to see boxes and suitcases piled up in the driveway. They arrived on Wednesday, November 20th, 2019, in a blue Honda Civic that was low on gas and the radio was crackling with static. Susan came in complaining about the cold wind, the dark hallway, and the strong smell of freshly polished floors. Charles dropped his keys on the kitchen counter, opened the refrigerator, and asked if there was any coffee ready. I hadn't yet realized that the dynamics of the house would change forever that day. For the first few weeks, I tried to act like a hostess, tidying up clean sheets, clearing space in the closet, pretending that everything was normal. But over time, every corner was taken over without me noticing. My sewing room became a repository for their documents and folders. The dining table was always littered with scattered papers, bank statements, utility bills, receipts, notes from Susan's work. She liked to sit and complain about the lines at the bank, her thankless life, and the neighbors who didn't even know how to clean the front of the house. My father would spend hours on the couch reading old newspapers and pretending to doze, but when he noticed I was around, he would raise his voice. "You have to be more organized, Amelia. Just because you inherited this house doesn't mean you can do everything your way." It was slowly creeping in, like dust accumulating on the furniture. It wasn't long before, during breakfast conversations, jokes began about how I didn't know how to manage a household, or how I didn't understand anything about bills or taxes. Charles would talk about how hard it was to raise such a naive daughter, how I didn't know how to value money. Susan liked to reminisce about every supermarket bill she paid for me when I was a child, and would say that now, with the family house, they would finally have a real home. Little by little, I stopped having a say in the decisions. When I realized it, the decisions weren't even my own anymore. They changed the curtains in the living room without asking, had cable internet installed with its own password, and even moved the dog. The landline became their reference, not mine. Their names started to appear in all the correspondence: health insurance, credit card bills, even advertisements for a pizza place were sent to the Reeds, not to me. I still kept the keys in my purse, but little by little it didn't even matter. I came home one night and saw that the lock had been replaced. Charles said it was for security reasons, because the old one was broken, but I only knew because I couldn't open the door. Susan handed me a copy without even looking at me. When I tried to say something, she said, "This is everyone's house, Amelia. Don't make a fuss." And so, slowly, I began to realize that every space occupied was a piece of me leaving. The garage, where I kept my boxes of memories, became Charles's makeshift workshop. Even the vegetable garden that Margaret and I had planted together was torn out to make way for the new garden that Susan had seen in a magazine. When I noticed, even my clothes were mixed up in their closet. I bought labels to try to separate them, but Susan thought it was funny. "That's too much, Amelia. Everything here is ours." The nights were the worst. I could hear their voices speaking softly in the hallway, talking about renovations, about how great it would be to have a Sunday barbecue, to invite relatives, to use Margaret's room for visitors. It seemed that the house, which for years had been my shelter, was now the setting for a life in which I was just passing through. Even the smell of breakfast was changing. I would wake up and, instead of Margaret's strong coffee, there would be the smell of burnt toast and fried eggs, the sound of dishes banging loudly in the sink. I tried not to get upset, but the small intrusions of everyday life began to wear on me. I felt my place shrinking with each passing week. Charles began calling the house our base, telling everyone it was the Reeds' home. I tried to correct him, but he always got a sly response, a disapproving look. It was as if I was lucky to be there, and not the other way around. One Friday night I caught Susan sitting in my room, looking through my drawers. All she said was, "I'm just tidying up, honey. This is a family home." It became more and more common. Decisions were made, things moved around, my space was emptied. My signature was no longer required for anything, not even to pay the water bill. When I realized, I was just another person there, doing chores and listening to orders. The comfortable silence of the house turned into the constant noise of loud television, ringing phones, neighbors coming in to ask about Charles or to return the borrowed lawnmower. The house, which used to be full of good memories, became a repository of small sorrows. Smiles, rare, were always accompanied by demands or jokes. My name was mentioned when it was time to remember bills, to complain about some mess, or to remind me how lucky I was to have inherited such a valuable house. Every day, I felt like I was losing more than just physical space. It felt like my story was being rewritten on pages that weren't mine. And that's when I realized that things could still get much worse. I thought I had seen it all, but I was wrong. Now tell me, if you were in my shoes, would you have the courage to fight for what is yours? Or would you let everything go by to avoid confrontation? Write in the comments what you would do if every piece of your life started to disappear before your eyes. And, looking back, I only realized that that was just the first step of a nightmare that was about to escalate. They never missed an opportunity to remind me, from a very young age, how expensive I was to maintain. When I was 10, I remember the $720 school bill being discussed at the dinner table as if it were a crime. "Amelia never gives anything back," my father would repeat, while my mother made a point of calculating out loud every penny for the uniform, the supplies, the snacks she bought. Over time, this math became routine. On Christmas in 2006, when I asked for a new coat, Susan told me that just what they spent on me was enough to make me feel more grateful. When I was 13, I started saving coins in the back of my drawer, because I thought that if I didn't ask for anything, at least I would have peace. But even that didn't help. My 18th birthday was the same day that they delayed paying the home insurance, and Charles made it clear in front of the entire family, "If it weren't for you, we would have been able to go on vacation." I didn't even give myself the right to respond. I just pretended not to hear. At first, I believed that this was normal, that every father had the right to demand. I only realized how distorted it was when I saw my friends' parents acting differently, celebrating their children's achievements instead of turning everything into debt. In 2015, I won my first partial scholarship to the University of Hartford. I still needed to supplement it with internship money, but Charles's comment was direct. "Now you'll learn to appreciate what's expensive." Nothing was ever enough. If I came home tired from my internship, they would remind me of the electricity and water bills that, according to them, exploded because of me. Every pizza I ordered, every medicine I bought at the drugstore downtown, everything was recorded as yet another reason to see me as dead weight. Susan used that pocket diary to write down purchases, schedules, appointments, and, of course, all the small debts that she said were mine. When Margaret died, I thought the pressure would decrease after all. I was 29 years old, had my own house, and had a steady job. But the opposite happened. The difference now was that the pressure was disguised as life advice. In practice, it was the same. You should save more, Amelia. You're wasting everything your grandmother left you. Or, just because it's in your name doesn't mean the house is yours alone, you know? My space, which was already small, got even smaller. The Christmas after I inherited it, I received a printed spreadsheet as a gift, detailing all the house's expenses since November of 2019. I thought it was a joke, but Charles was emphatic. It's so you can learn what responsibility means. But the biggest blow came when they decided to fulfill an old dream, to travel to Europe. They had never left the country, but now, with the house paid off, they saw the perfect opportunity. The itinerary was ready: Paris, Rome, Barcelona, and Lisbon. They made the reservations, bought the tickets, and I only found out about it all because I saw the savings account statement. The money came straight from my balance, accumulated through years of work, and part of the inheritance that Margaret had left. When I asked, Charles didn't hesitate. It's family money, and let's face it, who else would benefit from it if not us? Susan reinforced, you don't need to worry. Your job is to take care of the house while we're away. That was always the tone, as if I owed them something for being there. They traveled on February 25th, 2020, taking 2 large suitcases, 2 carry-on suitcases, and a folder full of hotel reservations, which Susan made a point of reviewing out loud while Charles went over the conversion from euros to dollars. While boarding, my mother sent me a message asking me not to forget to water the plants, and my father insisted that I pay the property tax by the due date, to avoid headaches. I watched on my cell phone screen as they smiled at the airport, took selfies, and wrote to relatives in the family group, finally making a dream come true, all thanks to our daughter. Not even a thank you. In the end, the bank account had dropped by almost $24,000 in 20 days of travel. When they returned, they brought 2 mugs and an Eiffel Tower keychain, as if that made up for everything else. For them, that was the world. I should be grateful because I was indirectly allowing them to make their dreams come true. The worst part is that I had already gotten used to this role of eternal debt. I always thought that at some point things would get better, that the bad phase would pass. But what happened next? No one could have predicted. Stories like this really touch us. So leave your like now and subscribe so you don't miss anything. The worst was yet to come. The night before they left for Europe, my mother came into my room carrying a box of old documents. I was trying to organize receipts and invoices to settle the month's bills when she sat on the edge of the bed, looked around, and let out a heavy sigh, the kind she only used to open difficult conversations. Amelia, I know we sometimes take it hard. Life hasn't always been easy for me and your father, but you've always been our priority. We just want to see you well, she said, placing her hand on my shoulder. Her sudden approach caught me off guard. Susan had never been one for many affectionate gestures. I don't remember her hugging me spontaneously, not when I was a child, not when I got my first job. But there, that night, she wrapped me in a half-tight, half-rehearsed hug and whispered, "Thank you for everything you do for us." I wanted to believe that she meant it. Charles appeared shortly after, knocking on the door and interrupting the silence. He was holding an envelope with the travel itinerary, talking about international health insurance and an emergency number in case he needed to call the embassy. Before leaving the room, he stopped at the door, looked at me, and said, without irony, "We would never have achieved any of this without your help, Amelia. Thank you." The words came out dry, but the look in his eyes was different from usual. For a few seconds, I felt that I had some value to them. I went to sleep with the strange feeling that, perhaps, all of that had served as some silent reconciliation. The next morning, I helped with the bags, accompanied them to the Uber, and checked that they had all the documents. Susan made sure to give me the house note to keep, the spare key to the blue drawer in the sideboard, the bank card for emergencies. Everything explained in a low voice, as if she finally trusted me. The ride to the airport was calm, unlike the arguments on other trips. When they arrived at the boarding gate, Charles still texted, "Don't worry, daughter. If you need anything, we're just an email away." I responded with a heart emoji, feeling a hint of relief. They boarded at 11:22 in the morning on a rainy Thursday. I spent the rest of the day organizing the house, throwing away old papers, washing bed linens, watering the plants as Susan asked. I called my Aunt Claire and told her that they had both traveled and that the house was finally mine for a few days. She laughed on the other end of the line and told me to enjoy the respite. During the first week of the trip, the messages were lively. Photos in front of the Colosseum, videos of us riding the tram in Lisbon, Susan wearing a red beret in Paris, Charles smiling in a corner cafe. They sent me audio messages every day, telling me about their adventures, the food, and the new people they had met. They both seemed lighter, happier than they had been on any Christmas or birthday together. I tried not to think about bills or pending matters. I just enjoyed the silence of the house. In the afternoons, I would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, put on some low-key music, and open my laptop to update my work spreadsheets. I slept better than I had in months. But over time, small details began to catch my attention. In the second week, Susan called me asking about some documents that were stored in a black box at the back of the hallway closet. She wanted to know if I had gone through the tax paperwork, saying that she needed it for safekeeping. I thought it was strange, but I told her that everything was there, just as she had left it. Then it was Charles, asking me to review the joint account. He needed to confirm that the balance was still sufficient to cover the rest of the trip. Until then, I thought it was just a concern of someone who doesn't like unexpected events. One night, I decided to stop by the makeshift office in the garage to get some receipts and found a list with the names of lawyers, notaries, and addresses of city offices. The handwriting was Susan's. There was a second page, full of notes about property transfers and instructions on how to write a deed. I wondered if I was being paranoid, or if they were watching something they weren't telling me. On Saturday, while sorting out the bills, I found an old text message from my mother on my phone, accidentally sent to the family group, in which she complained about how difficult I was, saying that she didn't know how much longer she could put up with the situation, but that she was almost convincing Charles that the house needed to change hands. I stared at the screen, feeling my hands grow cold. I tried to recall a recent conversation that could explain it, but I couldn't find anything. When I looked at the call history on my landline, I noticed several calls made to notary numbers and to the realtor who, years before, had helped Margaret regularize the deed. I realized that all that kindness, the hugs, the gratitude, weren't just nostalgia or guilt. It was preparation for something bigger, something I couldn't yet fully see. And when I started putting all the pieces together, I realized that the trip was just the beginning of a plan that was going to turn me upside down. What happened next was beyond anything I could have expected. In the third week of the trip, it was early March 2020, a Tuesday that started out just like any other. I woke up early, tidied up the kitchen, and sat on the bed to answer some work emails. My cell phone rang with an international number. I thought it was a mistake and let it ring. Then a call started on my laptop. It was Susan's Skype, connecting for a video call. Her face didn't appear, just the image of a beige curtain. I put it on hold while I finished a report. Minutes later, I heard voices coming from the laptop, without realizing that the microphone was activated and the sound was on the speakers. I didn't answer or end the call. I just let it play. Suddenly, the conversation changed tone, and I froze. Susan was talking to Charles from the other side of the world, unaware that I was listening. There was no sweetness, no concern, just that familiar coldness. Amelia is stubborn, but if you take it easy, she'll give in. You know she has nowhere to go, my mother said in a low voice, as if repeating something rehearsed. My father responded with that dry laugh, saying that they were already sorting everything out with the lawyer, that the trip was just a test. If she doesn't cause trouble, we'll start the process when we get back. The way she is, she doesn't even realize it. She's a burden, Susan. She always has been. Now it's time to secure ours. That went in like a knife. I couldn't breathe properly. I just stood there, motionless, listening more than I should have. They continued, planning in detail. Charles talked about permanent transfer. Susan explained how she would convince me to sign powers of attorney. They said it would be easy. Just insist that the house belonged to the family, that I didn't know how to take care of anything. My name, my achievements, everything was treated as bargaining chips. It was a conversation between accomplices, not between parents and daughter. The worst part was hearing my mother agree, saying that she always thought I was weak, incapable of making big decisions, that my grandmother only left the house to me because she felt sorry for me. The kind of thing no one imagines hearing, especially in their own room, surrounded by furniture that had witnessed their childhood, their birthdays, their cold December mornings smelling of cake. I began to understand that nothing they did was for free. Every gesture of kindness was a calculation. Every hug was a piece on the board. The rest of the connection turned to noise. My head felt dizzy. I got up to get a drink of water, tripped over a box of books, and dropped a glass on the floor. My hand was cold, my mouth dry. I stared at the digital clock on my bedside table. 11:16 in the morning. Everything was hammering away. Burden, weak, useless. Words spoken with conviction, without any sign of hesitation. The real weight wasn't in the bills they were throwing in my face, but in the blatant contempt. I realized that nothing had changed. They had just gotten better at hiding it. I went back to bed and tried to think, but all I got were little reminders every time I asked for some attention and only got demands in return. I spent the rest of the day replaying every conversation from the past few months, every sudden compliment, every dinner invitation, every strange gift. It wasn't care, it was preparation. I started thinking about the conversations I'd had with Margaret, the old letters where she'd told me never to let anyone take away my worth. I pulled out the box of mail tucked away in the back of my closet and reread my grandmother's firm words. Not every smile is sincere. Don't mistake closeness for love. Trust your instincts. It hit me like a confirmation. For the first time, everything made sense. The discomfort, the feeling of being an intruder in their own home, the questions about documents and bills. They didn't see me as their daughter. They saw me as a problem to be solved, an obstacle between them and the financial security they'd always sought. That night, I sat on the bathroom floor, the light off, trying not to cry out loud. I called Aunt Claire, but hung up before she could ring. I didn't want to share this with anyone, not at that moment. I looked in the mirror and tried to find some trace of weakness in my face, some clue as to why it had always been this way. But it was impossible to understand. I sat there, listening to the house breathe in silence, realizing that, despite everything, the worst was yet to come. I thought I had reached my limit, but I was wrong. The feeling of betrayal throbbed for hours, as if the whole house knew the secret before I did. That same night, as I lay face down on the pillow, I was overcome by a rage that kept me awake. It wasn't just sadness. It was the clarity of someone who finally understood everything. I spent the night tossing and turning, listening to every noise coming from downstairs. By the time the sun peeked through the curtains, I had made my decision. For the first time, I wasn't going to wait for someone to solve anything for me. I was going to act, without warning, without hesitation. I got up at 6:40 in the morning and went straight to the makeshift office in the garage, where I kept a red folder full of Margaret's documents. Death certificate, house deed, original power of attorney registered at the notary's office. My heart was pounding, but instead of paralyzing me, it served as a driving force. In less than 20 minutes, I reviewed all the papers line by line. I knew that everything was in my name, with no outstanding debts. I called a trusted broker, the same man who had brokered the sale of a piece of land for Aunt Claire 2 years earlier. His name was Alan. I was direct. I explained that I needed to sell the house as quickly as possible, preferably without my parents visiting, without intermediaries who could arouse suspicion. Alan didn't ask any questions. That same day, at 4:15, he texted me to say he had someone interested. A couple of doctors who had recently moved from Boston to the city were looking for a large furnished house with all the paperwork in order. I arranged to show them the property the following afternoon, without making a fuss. I spent the evening cleaning each room, putting away old mementos and photos in a separate box. I separated out my parents' belongings: clothes, travel albums, documents, jewelry, diplomas. I was meticulous. I didn't want any of theirs mixed in with my things. I rented a storage unit at Stowaway Storage on Southbrook Avenue for 90 days, paid in advance. I booked a moving company and asked for the utmost discretion. They would collect all of Charles and Susan's belongings, pack everything, and leave a detailed list of what was packed, including the paintings my mother insisted on hanging in the living room. When the couple came to visit, I tried to act normally, as if I were selling just a house and not the story of my life. The doctor, Anna, was delighted with the brightness of the room. Her husband spent more than 10 minutes asking about the heating system. I explained how my grandfather had adapted the old radiator in the 80s, because I always thought it was important to talk about the technical details, even though no one really seemed to care. We signed the purchase agreement 2 days later, on Friday, March 20th. The agreed amount, $1 million, deposited directly into my account. Alan hugged me quickly outside the notary's office and said he had never seen anyone so determined. While the bank transfer was going through, I took care of the rest. I called the shipping company to arrange for the pickup of my parents' belongings, asked for everything to be photographed and kept with identification. I sent an email to the accountant to let them know about the sale and asked for the tax calculation. I knew I couldn't afford any room for error. In less than 72 hours, everything that had any connection to Charles and Susan was out of the house. What was mine was packed away in a small suitcase, along with Margaret's letters, a few photos, and the antique wall clock she had given me for my last birthday. Everything else was packed away and out of reach. On Sunday, I returned to the empty house, sat on the living room rug, and took a deep breath. It was strange to see the space clean, without the usual objects, without voices echoing through the hallways. I wrote the note with a steady hand, without anger, without trembling. Surprise. The burden did this. I taped it to the front door, left the keys on the kitchen table, and left without looking back. On the way out, I looked one last time at the garden that Margaret tended, and felt her presence there with me. It was no longer fear, it was freedom. I walked down the street, carrying only my purse, listening to the sound of my footsteps and the noise of cars in the distance. For the first time, I felt that everything could be different. My cell phone beeped once, twice, 3 times. I ignored it. I left the phone on airplane mode and walked to the hotel where I had already booked a week's stay. I sat down on the bed, opened my laptop, and started researching places to start over. I still didn't know how I was going to tell Aunt Claire everything, but one thing was certain. No one would ever call me a burden again. I just didn't imagine that, on their side, the story was about to turn into a storm. The day my parents returned from their trip was the same day that a cold wind began to blow through the city, as if everything around them sensed that something out of the ordinary was about to happen. Charles and Susan arrived late in the afternoon, and the airport van stopped in front of the house. But the house was gone, at least not the way they remembered it. At the gate, they found the padlock had been replaced. The windows were empty, with no curtains, no flowers on the windowsill. The garden looked different, because the pots Margaret had tended were no longer there. When they tried to enter, they saw a note on the door. Surprise. The burden did this. It was impossible not to recognize my handwriting, impossible not to understand the message. In less than half an hour, my phone began to vibrate on the hotel table. Long messages, full of insults, then calls, then audios. I listened to them one by one, but I didn't delete anything. I saved everything, organizing them by date and time, creating a file on the computer with each word recorded. At first, I thought they were going to try to talk, to try to reach an agreement. No, they went straight to war. That same day, I received notifications of an attempted contact from a lawyer I didn't even know. The emails arrived at dawn, threatening legal action, demanding restitution of assets, inventing arguments to cancel the sale of the house. On the second day, Susan came to my work. She waited outside the building and approached me on the sidewalk, saying she wasn't going to leave until I returned everything. Her face had none of the rehearsed affection it had had before the trip. This time, she was red, her eyes fixed, each word an attack. "You're going to regret this, Amelia. We've always taken care of you, and this is how you repay us?" I didn't answer. I walked past her, entered the building, and went straight to my office. I stood there for 30 minutes staring at the monitor, my hands cold, but I didn't allow doubt to take over. That same week, I received a notice of a hearing, a letterhead left at the hotel reception. Charles tried to intimidate me, saying that he was talking to a judge who was known to the family, trying to scare me with stories of long lawsuits, loss of reputation, and freezing of assets. I called Margaret's family lawyer, explained the situation, and asked for guidance. He advised me to document absolutely everything: calls, messages, attempts at in-person contact. I started recording conversations, archiving all emails, and photographing any notices left at the gate of the new building where I was moving in. Each new attack became another layer of defense. Each threat was recorded. I had never done this before, but I learned the hard way. The days turned into a series of attempts to wear me down. My parents went to the local press, told a distorted version of the story, said I was ungrateful, that I had taken away from them the home I had earned with great sacrifice. They even called acquaintances from work trying to tarnish my name, saying I was mentally unstable, that I needed help. The attacks were coordinated, each week a different strategy. Throughout this storm, I remained firm. I did not respond to provocation. I did not give in to pressure. In times of doubt, I opened the digital file with their audios, read again the note I had left on the door. I repeated to myself, no one would ever make decisions for me again. Little by little, I began to understand that the retaliation wasn't just about the house. It was about losing control, about them no longer being able to manipulate me. They tried everything, contacting lawyers, influential acquaintances, even emotional blackmail, saying that Margaret would be ashamed of me if she saw what I had done. But I knew, with a certainty I had never had before, that Margaret left that house for me because she saw beyond the family. She knew everything, perhaps even before I did. When I realized it, I had created a complete dossier: dates, times, records, screenshots, recordings. I had to quickly learn to deal with the fear of being persecuted, the anger at being called ungrateful, the feeling of always being watched. I even thought about backing out, trying to resolve the situation with an apology. But I looked around, remembered the emptiness of that house, and understood that going back would be betraying myself again. I was the owner of my silence, of my story, and now also of my freedom. I just didn't imagine that they would insist so much, going beyond any limit that I thought possible. And it was on this new battlefield that I realized I still had a lot to face. By the end of that month, with the threats piling up, and my name being dragged into conversations I never asked to be a part of, I decided to accept one last meeting. I didn't want anything hidden anymore, or any more conversations over the phone. I sent a short message to Charles and Susan, setting up a meeting at a coffee shop far from the city center, the kind they despised when things were going well, but which now served as a place to guarantee privacy. It was a gray Tuesday, the kind when the city seems asleep and no one notices who comes or goes. I arrived early, ordered a black coffee, and sat facing the door, watching every movement that came from the street. When they arrived together, I realized right away that this was not to negotiate. This was to pressure. They sat in silence. Charles looked around. Susan adjusted her bag. Her hands were shaking, but her gaze was hard. I didn't waste time with formalities. I took my cell phone out of my bag, opened the recording file, and let it play on the table. Their voices, clear, cold, calculating how to bend me, telling me that I was just a burden in their lives. They both listened without blinking, as if they already knew I had heard everything. No one tried to hide it. When the recording ended, I left the device in record mode, because I had learned from my lawyer that any conversation about that needed to be documented. I spoke calmly, looking each of them in the eye. I said that the house was mine, that I had the legal and moral right to everything there. I made it clear that I was tired of manipulation, demands, and emotional blackmail. I warned them that from that moment on, any contact would need to be respectful, or it would end in a formal complaint. They didn't like it, obviously. Charles tried to laugh it off, calling it drama, saying that I was exaggerating. Susan pretended she didn't know anything, played the role of a worried mother, saying that it was all just a misunderstanding, that the family needed to unite. But there was no more room for doubts or pity. What hurt me the most was realizing how they denied everything. Even with the evidence on the table, they tried to turn the situation around, saying that Margaret would be ashamed of me, that I was destroying the family. But nothing there was new. Every word was part of the repertoire I've known since I was a little girl. But this time I was firm. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. I repeated what I needed to. The conversation was recorded. Every threat was registered. And from then on, any invasion of my life would be dealt with in court. When Charles slammed his hand on the table, saying that a real daughter would never do that, I looked straight at him and told him that what had never existed there was respect. The silence that followed that sentence was heavier than any scream. They tried to insist, threatened to cut off contact with the rest of the family, said they would isolate me, that I would miss them. This time, I didn't give in. I got up, picked up my cell phone, paid for my coffee, and left without looking back. On the way back to the hotel, I felt a strange relief, mixed with a tiredness that seemed to occupy every inch of my body. It wasn't happiness. It was a kind of heavy peace, full of scars. I knew that from then on, the noise of accusations would continue, but I also knew that finally, I had set limits. Margaret always said that respect is not demanded by shouting, but rather built with action. When I got to the room, I reread her letters again. I stood there in silence, thinking about everything I had carried up until that moment. It was then that I realized, no matter how hard they tried, nothing would take away from me what I had achieved. I just didn't know what to do with this new beginning yet, and it was at that exact point that my life began to truly change. Moving to another city wasn't just a geographic move, it was an act of survival. After the meeting at the coffee shop, I started to look at everything that still held me back. Familiar streets, old co-workers, the fear of running into someone I knew from my family. The following week, on a cloudy Tuesday in April, I closed the deal on a small house in Willow Springs, a town 80 miles away, far enough away to disappear from Charles and Susan's radar. It wasn't luxurious, nor did it have a flower garden like Margaret's, but for the first time the keys in my hand were mine alone, without the shadow of anyone telling me what to do. That month I accepted an invitation to join a small real estate agency, starting from scratch, carrying with me only an old laptop and a box of memories. At first, each morning was a test of courage, learning the streets, memorizing the names of my neighbors, introducing myself to strangers. Sometimes I still looked back expecting some new drama, some surprise call, but over time, that fear began to diminish. My work routine saved me, organizing visits, dealing with paperwork, explaining details of deeds to clients who had no idea about the difference between IPTU and ITBI. I realized that I was good at it, perhaps because I had spent my life studying contracts, trying to understand what was fair and what wasn't. Selling houses was different from selling empty dreams. I started therapy in May, right after a Sunday when I woke up feeling the weight of the previous months pressing against my shoulders. In the first few sessions, I could barely speak without feeling my throat tighten, but I gradually learned to release each knot, to name what I had experienced. In the process, I discovered old letters from Margaret inside a blue envelope hidden in the back of the bookcase. Simple sentences dated from 2003, 2007, and even a more recent one from 2020. You are so much stronger than you think, Amelia. Don't let anyone diminish what you have built. Reading that, in an empty, silent room, was more meaningful than any conversation I had had with my parents in years. I collected each small achievement, the first sales signature, the approval of financing from a client who became a friend, the invitation to give a talk on women's financial independence. Little by little, I realized that the city was no longer just a refuge but a place of belonging. The fear of retaliation from my parents gave way to the pride of being able to tell my story without feeling ashamed. Every now and then, I would still receive a rude message, an unknown number, someone wanting to know if everything was okay. I no longer responded. That urge to explain myself disappeared along with the keys to my old house. The best part of this new beginning was understanding that I no longer needed anyone's approval, especially not from those who had always put me down. It was a shock to realize how much the search for recognition had made me give up on myself for so many years. I discovered that Grandma Margaret's voice was the only one that really served as a reference for me, and when I felt homesick, it was to her letters that I returned. In Willow Springs, no one knew me as the problem child or the family's burden. I was just Amelia, the master of her own time, her own choices, and, ultimately, her own story. Looking back at everything I went through, recognizing every fear I overcame, every anger transformed into movement, made me feel whole again. It was in this mix of courage, mourning, and small new beginnings that I understood. There is only true peace when we stop trying to be accepted by those who never wanted to understand us. I never imagined that, by moving to another city, I would end up changing my life. I just didn't know yet how much this step was just the beginning of what was yet to come. It was little by little, almost without realizing it, that I began to transform my pain into something that would help others. When I realized that my story no longer paralyzed me, I decided that no one would ever have to carry alone that feeling of being trapped in a family that doesn't know how to protect, only demand. I started small. I wrote a text about financial abuse and sent it to a local women's support group. A week later, I was invited to share my experience in a discussion group. From that meeting, the embryo of the first workshop was born. There were 7 women in a borrowed meeting room, paper and pen in hand, wanting to understand how to break a cycle that seemed impossible to break. I put together a practical guide, teaching the basics: how to recognize signs of emotional manipulation, why to keep records and contracts, where to seek legal help without fear of judgment. There was no big production, just direct conversation, real examples, questions that no one asked at Sunday lunches. At each meeting, more people showed up. Exhausted siblings, adult children who had never felt like they owned anything, people like me, who just wanted to breathe without fear of reprisal. I received messages of gratitude, stories of courage, people saying that for the first time they felt respected at home. This became a routine, one Saturday a month, a room full, a piece of my story serving to change trajectories. At that time, I looked for Claire. It wasn't easy to get back in touch after years without exchanging letters, but she welcomed me with open arms. It was in an old cafe, on a quiet street, that I heard from her what Margaret already knew. She left you at home because she saw who you really were, not because of your last name, but because of your strength. Claire told me details about her past that I didn't know, showed me old messages from Grandma, explained that my grandmother always noticed how much Charles and Susan never accepted my presence, but she also never stopped believing that I would break that cycle. A year later, I put on some simple clothes and went to the Old Town Cemetery. The sun was low, the trees swayed slowly, and I sat next to Margaret's tombstone for over an hour, just giving thanks. I didn't ask for advice. I didn't cry because I missed her. I spoke quietly about everything that had happened, listing every achievement, every person I had met, thanks to the courage to not give up. There I knew for sure that inheritance was more than a house. It was a calling to build a life free from the burden of others. I returned to Willow Springs feeling for the first time that Margaret's strength truly lives within me. When I finished my last workshop of the year, I looked out at the packed room and understood the freedom I thought was mine alone now circulates among dozens of people. The cycle has finally been broken. I know what you felt listening to every word of this story, because it is impossible to go unscathed when the truth hurts, when the bond that should be a shelter becomes a chain. You have just experienced what it is like to be thrown on the edge between humiliation and courage, to feel firsthand what it is like to rebuild a life from scratch, without guarantees, without applause, without waiting for anyone to rescue you. It is this intensity that marks those who survive, because every time someone challenges the logic of their family, faces their fear, breaks the cycle of abuse, and rebuilds themselves, they create a strength that nothing and no one can erase. And you have followed it all this way. This puts you on the other side, on the side of those who do not close their eyes to injustice, of those who do not accept less than they deserve. Now tell me, would you have the courage to break with everything, face the pain, and seek your freedom, even if it means losing what you thought was indispensable? I want to see how far your truth goes. Comment below. The burden is over here. Write with the same conviction as someone who won't back down, because this is the kind of statement that shows the world that you no longer accept carrying a burden that isn't yours. This sentence is the beginning of a commitment to yourself, a message to those who never saw their worth. You already know the impact this story had on you. Because feeling the pain, the fear, the desire for revenge, and the relief of freedom is not something a passive spectator does. You were dragged into this battle. You felt every reaction. You heard in Amelia's voice everything that was never said at family dinners. Stories like this don't disappear. They change those who hear it. So, mark this moment. Leave your like. It's more than a button. It's a record that you were here, that you are part of a group that is not content to watch tragedies in silence. And there's no point in trying to stay away. You already belong here. Sign up now. Here. Each story is a tool for transformation, a new chance to see beyond appearances, to learn to recognize abuse, and most importantly, to take action. Turn on notifications because stories like this are rare, and each episode has the power to challenge you, to make you restless, to take you beyond what you thought you could handle. Don't wait for the next blow to wake you up. Come and experience the next stories before someone tells only the part that suits them. And you know that feeling that's stuck in your chest? It's not just curiosity, it's necessity. The next video is already on the screen, and you have no idea what you're about to hear. Get ready for a story that will dismantle you, challenge everything you think about survival, limits, and the price of being free. Click now. Don't just stand there while the impossible happens before your eyes once again. This channel is for those who feel, react, and transform. You've already crossed that line. Now, come with me to the end.